Fetzer, I'm going to address the moon landings, how we know we didn't go on the occasion of the exchange between student groups representing pro and con positions of the moon landing, where the group from Turkey argued in support of the hypothesis that we had gone to the moon, that the moon landing was on the up and up, and where Lance from Canada argued the alternative that we didn't go, and where, as I observed in my comments on their exchange, the evidence that we did not go is simply overwhelming, abundant, and compelling, as I'm going to explain here. One of the sources I recommend for stimulating thinking about whether or not we went to the moon is a documentary entitled Conspiracy Theory, Did We Land on the Moon?, which was released in 2001. My wife and I were visiting London and staying at the Morgan Hotel on Bloomsbury Street, which backs onto the British Museum, when I turned on the BBC and found this program, this documentary playing, which offers one scientific proof after another that we did not go to the moon. Because of my background as a philosopher of science, with a PhD in the history and the philosophy of science, where the history of science is dominated by the history of astronomy and physics, I was completely hooked and have invested a fair amount of time in research on the moon landing issue, pro and con, especially because it's such a fascinating subject for courses in critical thinking, for example, which I offered for 35 years, where you want to explain the principles of reasoning and how they apply in a case of this kind. A film that's further suggestive and therefore has great heuristic value is Capricorn 1, which offers an illustration of how it could have been done, in this case, with an attempted manned mission to Mars, where NASA explains to the astronauts before they enter the spaceship for launch that they discovered technical problems that meant they would not have survived the trip. The real reasons, of course, being that it couldn't have happened in any case anyway, but where they use a single grainy television feed to present the evidence to make it difficult to sort out what was going on. This is very, very provocative. It offers one illustration of how it might have been done as an alternative to the official account, about which we have received a superabundance of information from the government over and over and over again since the moon landings officially took place roughly 50 years ago. Now, scientific reasoning has 4 stages: puzzlement, speculation, adaptation, explanation. Puzzlement: something doesn't fit into your background knowledge and experience, and therefore you want to sort it out, figure out what actually happened. Speculation: what are the possible alternative explanation of what's taken place? Here we've seen, for example, in this instance, the alternatives that we actually went, but maybe there's a few dangling loose ends that can be easily straightened out, or that we didn't go at all, and that this was a very elaborate, carefully contrived deception of the public. Adaptation: what are the probabilities of the available evidence on the alternatives? Where a crucial aspect of evaluating the alternative hypotheses is sorting out the authenticity of the evidence. Because it turns out, for example, in the case of JFK, as another illustration, when you sort out the available evidence, when you discover, for example, that the autopsy x-rays were altered to conceal a fist-sized blowout to the back of the head, when you discover that the brain shown in diagrams and photographs in the National Archives, which is a virtually completely intact brain, cannot possibly be photographs and diagrams of the brain of JFK. When you discover that the whole movie, such as the Zapruder and the Nix, have been massively edited to exclude crucial information and conceal the true causes of death of our 35th president, you become overwhelmingly convinced that, in fact, the official story of Lee Oswald as the lone demanded assassin becomes increasingly implausible, particularly when you discover further proof of manufacturing evidence to convict him, including, for example, the backyard photographs, where the individual has a block chin is a bit too big to be Lee Oswald, where you have his face pasted on someone else's body, as he explained to Will Fritz. When the Mannlicher Carcano could not possibly have fired the rounds because, according to the official account, JFK was killed by the impact of high-velocity bullets. But the Mannlicher Carcano is not a high-velocity weapon. When you learn that Lee Oswald actually was in the doorway of the book depository, then the evidence becomes overwhelming that he was framed and that the conspiracy assumes a completely different aspect. Similarly here, in the case of the moon landing, when we sort out the authentic from the inauthentic or fabricated evidence, the situation becomes very clear and unproblematical. When you prefer the hypothesis that confers a higher probability upon the evidence, if it were true, then we find not only is a JFK a conspiracy hypothesis overwhelmingly preferable to the lone gunman hypothesis, but the hypothesis that we did not go to the moon is overwhelmingly preferable to the hypothesis that we did, where, as the fourth stage, when the evidence has settled down, we're entitled to accept the best supported hypothesis as true in the tentative and fallible fashion of science, meaning that even though it is the best supported, we're fallible in acknowledging that no empirical or scientific truth is guaranteed to be true, and that with the availability of new information or alternative hypotheses, we may have to revise those we have accepted as the best explanation, reject hypotheses we've accepted, accept hypotheses we've rejected, and leave others in suspense. So the moon landing is a perfect illustration of the application of these stages in scientific reasoning, which is also the case, of course, for the example of JFK. Now, it's important in reasoning to appreciate the difference between three different kinds of impossibilities, where violations of any of these three kinds shows that what we're dealing with cannot possibly be true. Logical impossibilities. They could not be the case because the description is contradictory. Having, for example, both a tapered chin and a square chin at the same time, where the backyard photographs, for example, cannot be of Lee because he had a tapered chin, and the figure in the photographs has a square chin or a block chin. Now, of course, at different times, one and the same person could, because of facial or reconstructive surgery, have a tapered chin turned into a block chin or vice versa, but we cannot at one and the same time have a man with both a square chin and a tapered. Since Lee's was tapered before, tapered when he was arrested, it's evident he didn't undergo some kind of reconstructive surgery, and therefore the figure in the backyard photographs cannot be Lee. Physical. They are claims that can't be the case because they violate the laws of physics, chemistry, biology. For example, one and the same person can't be in two places at the same time. So when we have reports of Lee Oswald being at the Texas Theater buying popcorn from Butch Burroughs, at the same time Officer Tippit was being shot a quarter mile away, it cannot be the case that Lee Oswald was in both locations, though of course there could have been an imposter at the Texas Theater while Lee was shooting Tippit, or imposter shooting Tippit while Lee was at the Texas Theater. The fact is we cannot allow laws of physics, chemistry, or biology to be a part of an acceptable account of any event. Historical couldn't happen because it's already happened before. We couldn't be the first to release the Zapruder film to the public today because it was already done by Robert Groden back in '75. We couldn't be the first to climb Mount Everest today because it was already done by Sir Edmund Hillary. We couldn't be the first to marry Marilyn Monroe because that's happened before, indeed, a good number of times. So the very first consideration, I think, that has to come into account concerns the Van Allen radiation belt, which are a torus or donut shape of energetically charged particles circling Earth around its magnetic equator, held in place by Earth's magnetic field. The main belts extend from an altitude of about 1,000 to 6,000 kilometers above the surface, in which region radiation levels vary. Most of the particles that form the belts are thought to come from solar wind and other particles by cosmic rays. In order for the Apollo or any lunar mission to be successful, therefore, the equipment and crew aboard the spacecraft would have to be adequately shielded from exposure to the intense radiation surrounding the planet Earth. And yet we have a spokesman for NASA unwittingly revealing that the Van Allen radiation belt prohibits human spaceflight. This occurred in 2012. Since Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, passed away a few days ago, I thought I'd post the following NASA article released about 10 hours ago. The following is conduct with a certain username. NASA is still seeking to develop technology to safeguard humans for spaceflight into radiation-laden space within and beyond the Van Allen radiation belts and the protection protected by our magnetosphere. Until that technology is available, our exploits into space will continue to be well below the beginning of radiation belts so intense. Van Allen called them a sea of deadly radiation. We know from the effects of radiation on Earth that Apollo, therefore, was nothing more than a fantasy. According to this YouTube vid and many others, every spaceship, whether Russian or American, with humans aboard, beginning in 1961 to the present, all have maintained altitudes of 1,000 miles below the Van Allen radiation belt. The only craft to go through the 25,000 miles of those belts allegedly was the Apollo. But we can see now already that it's a physical impossibility that we should have sent manned missions to the moon unless we could cope with the Van Allen radiation belt, which according to NASA itself, we still are seeking to develop this technology to safeguard humans for precisely that kind of space travel. Now, I published a book entitled, and I suppose we didn't go to the moon either, which was proposed by the series editor, Mike Palachek, as a sequel to our first book. These are edited collections with multiple contributors entitled Nobody Died at Sandy Hook, because the popular opinion is so immersed that they would find that incredible, so that a response to a book with a title, Nobody Died at Sandy Hook, even though it has 13 contributors, including 6 current or retired PhD college professors, might well be. And I suppose we didn't go to the moon either. But the fact of the matter is there's a massive evidence that we did not go to the moon. There are 4 chapters in the book about this particular issue. There are also 4 about the death and replacement of Paul McCartney, which appears to have occurred on 9/11/1966. 2 on the first death of Saddam Hussein, 2 on the second death of Osama bin Laden, and then 4 on the history of World War II, where events appear to be very, very different than historians have claimed. In any case, one of the articles contributed to the book, for which I have a special affection, is by Winston Wu, The Apollo Moon Hoax, 35 Proofs We Didn't Go, which begins with a quote from Michael Rivero. Americans don't need to lie to themselves. That's what the government is for. Very, very well said. Among Winston's observations in initiating his discussion of reasons for doubting NASA's historic manned mission lunar landings, the bigger the lie, the easier it will be to believe Adolf Hitler. This is based upon human psychology that, while ordinary citizens are used to small lies, not explaining where you really were on a specific occasion, or what you really did with the money that used to be in your wallet, or who you were really talking to on the phone. If those issues would, for example, upset your wife, they're used to making little lies, but the idea of a lie on the enormity of having gone to the moon when it didn't really happen, as Hitler observed, it turns out to be easier to promote. And as Will Rogers or Mark Twain observed, it's easier to lie to a man than to convince him he's been lied to. It's easier to fool a man than to convince him he's been fooled. That is well illustrated by cases of the kind we're discussing here. As Winston observes, of all possible conspiracies, the moon landings of 69 through 72 are seen of accomplishments, a pillar of American pride, being the first to go to the moon. The landings have become like a sacred religion, taboo to question. Anyone who does that is assumed to be crazy. So at first, you might think that any notion of the Apollo moon landings being a hoax or crazy and absurd, something only lone nutcases believe. However, the fact of the matter is you really can't know if the Apollo moon landings were real unless you've been there yourself, or alternatively, better, have actually studied the evidence. So all you can do is take it on faith that man landed on the moon. It's only when you dig deeper, examine the evidence, and employ critical thinking with logic rather than emotion that the facts begin to shock and disturb you. You begin scratching your head. Then when you wake up and see the obvious, that your common sense was subdued all along by faith, emotion, pride, and groupthink. Consider the following evidence, arguments, and points, and you realize the moon hoax case is a lot stronger than you imagine. You realize the probability of one of the two alternative hypothesis is very likely to be true. H1, the moon landings were a hoax and we never went there. Or H2, we went to the moon, but there's a dark secret surrounding it that caused us not to go back, and that led to the faking of at least some of the videos and photos of the moon. So before you think I'm crazy, please hear me out first. Let's start with the strongest argument first. Here are some shocking facts that'll leave you scratching your head about the inability to send men to the moon today, which means they could not have in 1969. Fact. Every major technological accomplishment in history has been repeated well under 40 years, except one. Within 40 years of Christopher Columbus setting foot in America in 1492, thousands of other Europeans had done the same. Within 40 years of the Wright brothers' flight across the Atlantic Ocean in 1903, thousands of other people had done the same. Within 40 years of Sir Edmund Hillary reaching the summit of Mount Everest in 1953, thousands of other explorers have done the same. And within 40 years of Yuri Gagarin's orbit of Earth in 1961, many others have done the same. Yet 40 years after 12 men allegedly set foot on the moon in 1969-72, not a single person or country has done it, nor attempted to do so, including the Russians who were ahead of us in the space race. Does this not seem highly strange and illogical? Fact. Since the Apollo moon missions in 1969-72, which sent astronauts 240,000 miles to the moon and back 6 times, no one has ever gone higher than 400 miles above the Earth. Even the space shuttle missions have gone below, remaining well under 400 miles. Fact, so far, 14 astronauts have died in space shuttle missions that went 200 miles above Earth. Yet during the Apollo program, NASA allegedly sent astronauts 240,000 miles to the moon and back 6 times with no loss of life at all. In other words, 200 miles, 14 casualties, 240,000 miles, 0 casualties. Does that seem odd? Would you buy that? Can you fathom the enormous difference between 200 and 240,000 and how big a stretch that is? Then he proceeds to very specific examples. In many Apollo photos of the alleged moonwalks, the astronauts are seen standing in shadows and while being clearly lit up and illuminated. This can only be possible if there was a second light source other than the sun. But officially, the astronauts did not bring any light devices with them, not even flashlights. This means artificial lighting must have been used, such as on a movie set. Here are more sample images. Here's one of an astronaut with the alleged sun behind him, yet every detail of his suit is visible when he should be merely a silhouette. Similarly, in this photo, the sun is behind the astronaut and limb, yet a secondary light source appears to be coming from the other direction. Here's The shadows diverge and converge in many of the moon landing photos. Some of them converge at perpendicular 90 degrees angles. This cannot be true if there's only one light source. The sun, as NASA alleges, under the sun, shadows run parallel to each other. They do not converge or intersect because of the immense distance of the sun from the objects that are being illuminated. If there were a much closer light source, of course, then they might well have divergent shadows. But notice here how the astronaut, for example, at the top left, is illuminated even though he's in the shadow and therefore should be completely in the dark. Here's a alleged moon lander, which, as Lance so brilliantly explained, is a very flimsy piece of equipment. I do not believe it could sustain a drop from 30 feet without falling apart. It looks very much like an elementary school science project as a mock-up using tinfoil and lightweight aluminum tubes for a very shabby piece of construction. If you do a close-up on the moon pads, for example, moreover, you find there's no dust surrounding it. In fact, if we return, look at the lander. This is supposed to have come down into what NASA claims is 5 or 6 inches of moon dust, but there's no blast crater. That's clearly a physical impossibility because a moon lander landing in moon dust would blow the dust everywhere. And yet, as I've observed, we don't find it even on the landing pads. The famous photo of Buzz Aldrin standing in the sunlight is a giveaway since he's been lit up in a spotlight from alleged sunlight while the ground around him is shrouded in darkness. How can the sun put a spotlight around a particular person like a stagehand pointing a spotlight on an actor or singer on stage? This was obviously a major screw-up, and NASA was reckless for thinking no one would notice or they could get away with it. In fact, it was such a blunder, NASA itself tried to cover it up by brightening the rest of the surface in subsequent versions. Why would they do that if they had nothing to hide? Here's the original from NASA, released in 1969 talk. Here's the brightened version with a surface for the Lunar Surface Journal to hide the discrepancy. Apollo defenders can't explain this at all, so they resorted to deception by claiming that the edited version is the original. But Gerald White proved unequivocally that the spotlight version is the original by showing the newspaper clippings from 1969, which he showed in his YouTube video, Moon Faker, posing for the portrait. So again, why would NASA alter the photos if it had nothing to hide? In many food photos, you can see a distinct line between the foreground and the background, which consists of different textures on each side. This indicates the background is artificial, as in a movie set. Here's a clear example from a famous Apollo photo of an astronaut sitting next to an American flag, saluting next to an American flag. Notice the backdrop also looks like a wall that's just behind the astronaut rather than actual scenery in the distance. And notice the distinct line between the dirt and the white layer behind him. This line between background and backdrop is explained and demonstrated in the documentary Kubrick's Odyssey by Jay Weidner of sacredmysteries.com, which you can see on Vimeo. Weidner postulates that the legendary director Stanley Kubrick was probably hired to fake the moon landing photos and videos due to his exceptional skill in these techniques, as demonstrated in his film 2001: A Space Odyssey. For an online analysis with example viewer download how Kubrick faked the moon landings using a technique known as front screen projection, which makes the details of the background just as precise as in the foreground, and where you characteristically have lines dividing the foreground from the background. Though if you're not a professional, you may be taken in. This is a particularly fascinating study by Jack White, who is a legendary photo and film analyst with whom I collaborated on JFK. This is 2 different versions of Buzz Aldrin. Above, Buzz has a big helmet, short legs, long arms in the chest area with a set of controls at the right. But above, Buzz has short arms, longer legs, smaller helmet, and different chest controls at left. Judging from the red spot, he's standing in the same place. There are even photos of astronauts' boots reflecting light when the sun is behind them, which can only be from fill lights coming in from the side. There's no way to refute that. Here are a couple of sample images. And here we have the fascinating phenomenon of boot prints in the dust. I'm going to make a key point about the dust, that either it reflected these boot prints and would retain impressions or not. What's particularly interesting is in the circled area, it's a boot print that appears to come from a tennis shoe, not one of the astronauts' own boot prints. That obviously raises serious concerns of fakery. Indeed, virtually every point I'm making, as in the case of those Lance made, is a sufficient condition in and of itself to prove that the moon landing was faked. Here we have moon rovers where there are no tracks. The moon rover has no tracks in front, no tracks behind, no tracks in the middle. I mean, notice if it had been moving to get the front wheels where they are, you'd have to have tracks between the front wheels and the back. This suggests that it was dropped down by a crane onto the set. But here's the more important point. We have some images such as this that show boot tracks in the dust. We have other images such as this showing that the moon rover leaving no tracks. Now, either the moon dust retains tracks or it does not. My frank opinion is that because there's no atmosphere and no moisture on the moon, that the moon dust would not have retained tracks any more than the Sahara sands would retain tracks. And therefore, it's more plausible to have no tracks than to have tracks. But if it does retain tracks, then these photographs show that it was faked. And if it doesn't retain tracks, then these photos show it was fact. Either it retains tracks or it doesn't. So either way, we have proof of fakery. Here's from a website, Astrofax, as I recall, which makes a rather crucial point vis-a-vis the moon lander. Fact: the lunar rover had inflatable tires, which would have exploded if pre-inflated, and there was no air on the moon to inflate them. Pro-Apollo nutters claim the rover had solid mesh wires. Yes, the rover in the museum had these fitted in the mid-70s when they realized pneumatic tires could not have functioned on the moon. NASA has had over 47 years in which to clear up the plainly obvious mistakes within the Apollo program. Each time someone brings up a query, NASA corrects it and says nothing. Ask NASA to correct it, they say nothing. They can't say why the anomaly was there in the first place. I have pictures of the rover supposedly on the moon. It has the same tires and same tire valves as ones they use at KSC. In other words, it's the same one. Earlier close-up pictures of the rover on the internet have changed since the blunder was exposed on this website. Here you have, problems with the absence of shadows where there should be shadows. Notice the shadows are being cast to the right, but the flag itself casts no shadow. Something, therefore, is completely wrong. Obvious proof of manufactured evidence. Here's another. The source of sunlight is off stage to the left according to the shadows. They form a faraway source, but a faraway source like the sun should be parallel. From a close sun, the light rays would diverge as seen in this Apollo 14 photo because the light's so much closer. The shadows can be used to point to the light source. Here's a fascinating. This photograph was removed from the Project Apollo image gallery after computer analysis revealed that the sun was really no more than a giant light bulb. Once again, as I say, in virtually every instance, the proof being adduced here is sufficient in and of itself to refute the authenticity of our having gone to the moon. Another source, however, this in my opinion is the strongest argument that those who persist in claiming we went to the moon can advance, is that the astronauts brought back moon rocks. Well, this is very interesting. It turns out that in one instance, a piece of moon rock that was given to the Dutch turned out to be a piece of petrified wood. Here is what Winston Wu had to say about it. They can't say that moon rocks are so similar to Earth that the moon rocks must have come out of the Earth, while at the same time claiming that moon rocks must have genuinely come from the moon because their chemical composition is distinctly different. They can't have it both ways, or I'm waffling like that. See the Moon Faker FAQ below in Gerald White's YouTube series on Moon Faker moon rocks. When the European Space Agency Smart 1 probe crashed into the Lake of Excellence, a lunar Maria region, it was reported that the minerals it kicked up were different from those of the Apollo moon rocks. Since NASA does not allow any scientist who wants to examine their moon rocks to just come and take them, how can there be so much independent verification? In fact, the moon rock that Armstrong and Aldrin gave to the Dutch Prime Minister turned out to be a piece of petrified news, which made international news. This incident has never been explained. Why would the Apollo astronauts give a fake moon rock to Holland? Or was it somehow switched in Holland? And if the moon rocks are fake, what does it say about the whole mission? A point I would add to previous discussion is the following. Werner von Braun headed an expedition to the Antarctic well before the alleged moon landings in order to pick up moon rocks that had been dislodged by the impact of small asteroids with the moon and captured by Earth's gravitational field and brought down to the surface of Earth. Thereby, they could present moon rocks that were actually bona fide moon rocks, but that simply hadn't arrived on Earth by the mode of transportation alleged. Conclusion: moon hoax is overwhelmingly probable. I hope I've convinced you I'm not crazy after all, says Winston Wu. Hopefully you can see the totality of logical arguments, reasons, and facts cumulatively constitute a powerful case to question the authenticity of the Apollo moon landings. Taken separately, each may raise an eyebrow. Taken all together, they constitute a strong case that either H1, the moon landings were a hoax and we never went there, or H2, we went to the moon, but there's a dark secret surrounding it that caused us not to go back, and that led to the faking of at least some of the videos and photographs of the moon. All the evidence, fake photos, logic, and common sense point to H1, the hoax explanation. On the other hand, the argument that we did go to the moon is scanty, shady, nonsensical, and mostly based on religious faith and pride, rather than anything provable. Thus, the weight of the evidence and data lean more heavily on the hoax side. On the balance of scales, the evidence for the moon hoax would win by a landslide. Now, here's another proof advanced by Jack White that is purely quantitative. Let's arbitrarily calculate a minimal time for these tasks and subtract from the available photo time. What Jack did was to look at the total number of photographs that NASA claims were taken during the various moon landing missions and add up the total and divide it by the amount of time that was available to take the photographs. The simplicity of his argument has considerable force because it does not presuppose any special knowledge of photographic anomalies or defects. The agency wants the world to believe that 5,771 photographs were taken in 4,834 minutes. But if nothing but photography had been done, such a feat is clearly impossible, made even more so by all the documented activities of the astronauts. Imagine 1.19 photos every minute that men were on the moon. That's one picture every 50 seconds. The secret NASA tried to hide has been discovered. The quantity of photos purporting to record the Apollo moon lunar EVAs could not have been taken on the moon in such an impossible time frame. So why do these photos exist? How did these photos get made? Did any men go to the moon, or was it truly the greatest hoax ever? But it's not merely the staggering number of photographs that undermines the evidence, but the existence of any photographs at all. Cosmic Maze, Jim Fetzer, suspect would have contaminated photographic plates and made moon photography impossible. Another argument, by the way, is that although the cameras were mounted external to the spacesuits, where the astronauts could not even focus or frame them, all of the image that NASA has presented are perfectly framed and focused. That is not merely preposterously improbable, but verges on the optical impossibility. Also, we have the problem that according to the astronaut, they could not see stars in the sky. You got Neil Armstrong. The sky is black, you know. It's a very dark sky. Mike Collins on Gemini 10. My God, the stars are everywhere, above me on all sides, below me somewhat, down there next to that obscure horizon. The stars are bright and they are steady, written 14 years later. And remember that the Gemini 10 spacewalk photo shown here has now been proven fake. So we're getting inconsistent reports that they wanted to cover it up. Mike Collins on Apollo 11. I can't see the Earth, only the black starless sky behind the Agena rocket. As I slowly cartwheel away from the Agena, I see nothing but the black sky for several seconds. What I see is disappointing, for only the brightest stars are visible through the telescope, and it's difficult to recognize them when they are not accompanied by the dimmer stars. Gene Cernan on Apollo 17. When the sunlights come through the blackness of space, it's black. I didn't say it's dark, I said black. So black, you can't conceive how black it is in your mind. The sunlight doesn't strike on anything. So all you see is black. Yuri Gagarin, the first Russian cosmonaut. Astonishingly cold, bright, cold stars could be seen through the windows. Of course, that's not on Mars, but on space or low orbit in the Earth's atmosphere. So the fact is that on Earth, on the Mars, on Moon, because of the lack of atmosphere, we wouldn't get a twinkling effect from the stars that is caused by refraction in the atmosphere. But they ought to have appeared as a billion points of light that would have been bright and just shown the heavens ablaze. So there was a fundamental blunder and inconsistency here in their reports about the heavens. Fact. Despite numerous photos being taken of the moon's surface, not one of them contains any frame showing planet Earth in the void of space. I would think that's a very poor planning on the part of astronauts, so we already know why this is so. Lance actually showed one where they had faked in the image of Earth. Fact, Neil Armstrong suffered with mental illness in his later years, a direct result of him putting his name forward as a foundation stone for the biggest lie in history. Or could it be that he became paranoid by the overwhelming number of websites exposing him as a liar? And why was he buried at sea after his death? Fact, rumor has it that Apollo 12 astronaut Pete Conrad was going public about the fake moon landings on the 30th anniversary back in July 1999. He was killed in a motorcycle accident 1 week before the 30th anniversary. Fact, it takes a space shuttle 66 hours to reach the International Space Station, which is a mere 200 miles above Earth. NASA claims Apollo 13 was 55 hours in its duration from liftoff when it encountered a problem at a distance of 200,000 miles from Earth. Get this, outright murder. Shortly before the 1967 test pad fire that killed 3 astronauts, Grissom, White, and Chaffee, Virgil Grissom told his wife, Betty, if there's ever a serious accident in the space program, it's likely to be me. He had become a critic of the space program, had expressed unease about the success of actually getting men on the moon. The decision to run this test with pure oxygen at pressure was nothing short of moronic. It created a calorimetric bomb, which was set off by the astronauts being told to flip switches that caused tiny sparks. Immediately after the test pad fire, before anyone was notified, government agents raided Grissom's home and took all of his personal papers. When they returned his papers to his widow, his personal diary and all papers containing the word Apollo were missing. 5 other astronauts died in accidents that same year. Before the first Apollo manned mission left the launch pad, 11 astronauts had died in accidents. Grissom, White, and Chaffee in the capsule fire. Freeman, Bassett, C., Rogers, Williams, Adams, and Lawrence died in airplane crashes. Remember, these are the world's best pilots flying their private aircraft. Government-supplied jet trainers, very safe craft. And Givens was killed in a car crash. In 1970, Taylor died in a plane crash. Fact, NASA had not perfected the lunar landing craft in time for Apollo 11. In 2016, they're still trying to get a rocket to land and take off again over 47 years after Apollo was supposed to have done just that. Fact, film footage taken inside the capsule of all Apollo missions shows a light blue haze and curvature of Earth through capsule window when they were supposedly halfway to the moon and in the blackness of space. This proves the capsule was only in Earth orbit. Fact, moon pictures on NASA's website are fake with backdrop scenes pasted. The pictures reveal black line penciled in where background meets daylight sky, which was blacked out completely. Fact, the LM used on later missions was the same spec as the first mission, that is, with no modification. It would have therefore been impossible to carry the rover vehicle to the moon in the same confined LM, even if it collapsed into a more compact form. There's a rather fascinating book on the moon landing that's attempting to provide evidence that we went to the moon by Richard Platt and David Hawcock. But look at the image on the cover. It's one where the face mask shows a reflection of another astronaut, where we see the other astronaut, whereas Lance observed the figure in the foreground, the shadow, is not wearing a spacesuit, and where a fascinating point has been made here in the bottom paragraph. The color photo on the book shows two lunar astronauts as Ralph Rene calls them, where he's an expert on the lunar photographs. One reflecting in the other's visor. The reflected astronaut is not holding a camera. So who took the picture with only two men on the moon? Also, the same piece of what appears to be a scaffolding, in the same photo, a piece of what appears to be scaffolding with a spotlight on it appears at the left edge of the photo. I've seen this photo in several other places, but it's always cropped, so the scaffolding is missing. Revert to the top here, evidence of pictures. Rene begins with photographic evidence. The more one looks at photos of the Apollo landing, the more one begins to wonder. No blast craters under the lunar modules. No dust arose from the rocket-softened landings. Though the lunar rovers tossed dust into the air, though there were an atmosphere acting on the particles. Questions. One important early fake photo is shown here in sequence. Photo 1 is from the book Carrying the Fire by astronaut Michael Collins. It shows Collins in a no-gravity test inside an airplane. Photo 2 is from the same book and is allegedly of Gemini 10 spacewalk. Rene noticed something fishy about these photos and reversed number 1 and sized it so he could overlay it on number 2. They match. They are the same photo. And this is official NASA output. Rene's book shows several other interesting photos that indicate various anomalies. On a splashdown photo of Gemini 6A, there's a whip antenna in excellent condition, clearly shown with no burn marks or scorching, even though they were encountering 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit on re-entry. No other Gemini had this antenna, and simple logic indicates it would have burned off during re-entry. Such an antenna is designed for frequencies not used in space. So here's the photograph on the left in a no gravity, in a low orbit spacewalk, but yet NASA reversed the image and used it, the same photo, twice for allegedly during a walk in actual space. Clear evidence of fraud. My favorite of the photo anomalies is shown here as photo 3, which Rene has titled, "The Anomaly is Obvious." This is a photo of Armstrong holding the staff and Aldrin holding the flag. While the two astronauts are basically the same height, the shadow of Armstrong is only 75% the length of Aldrin's. The shadows are not parallel but converge, indicating additional sources of light. He used trig to discover Aldrin's personal source of illumination is at 26.4 degrees of altitude, while Armstrong's is at 34.9. The sun was at 13.5 degrees altitude on the real moon. So where were these guys? Certainly not where we've been led to believe. Perhaps a soundstage in the American desert? NASA allegedly shot tens of thousands of pictures of the lunar landing, yet it's very difficult to procure even a decent percentage of these, and the same ones show up in most publications. The television footage of the first moon landing was very poor. While having access to the finest technology, NASA would not allow a direct feed of the footage, but forced networks and news services to film through an optically enlarged television screen, adding quite a bit of distortion. Very much, I would add, as Capricorn 1 demonstrates could be done to obfuscate, in that case, that we did not undertake a manned mission to Mars. During the Apollo 16 lunar liftoff, the camera followed the ship up off the surface. This is the liftoff off of the moon. No one was left on the moon, so who panned the camera? NASA later claimed the camera was radio controlled from Earth, but how could they have followed the ship so closely given the transmission time lag? So here you have the two in the photograph that he was addressing that has raised additional questions. He refers to them as Mutt and Jeff. When you get back to serious questions, the Russians have done some completely brilliant work. Here is a candidate of technical sciences, the General Director of Scientific Manufacturing Enterprise, Project DMSK from Russia, demonstrating that we did not have the propulsion power to launch the Saturn V and to escape Earth orbit. This is objective scientific findings showing that we lack the technological capability to perform the feat NASA claimed that we performed. Here's another, and I find this equally devastating. This is a recent proof that illustrates the principle that when you have a true hypothesis, you can find additional confirming evidence from unexpected sources. The latest proof comes from the temperatures that the spacecraft would have had to endure had we gone to the moon. In NASA admits we never went to the moon on ForbiddenKnowledgeTV.net, 21 September 2017. We learned that the melting points of the materials of which it was made, aluminum alloy, stainless steel, titanium, nickel steel alloy 7, and heat-resistant glass, would have been exceeded passing through the thermosphere en route to the moon. A spacecraft made of these materials, therefore, would have melted in flight. Temperatures in the thermosphere up to 400 miles above Earth's surface, which can reach from 930 degrees Fahrenheit to 3,630 degrees Fahrenheit, for example, which exceeds the melting points of the materials of which the spacecraft is made: aluminum oil, 671 degrees Fahrenheit, stainless steel, 2,750 degrees Fahrenheit, titanium, 3,034 degrees Fahrenheit, nickel steel oil alloy, 2,647 degrees Fahrenheit, heat-resistant glass, 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. Here's another anomaly of a less major kind, but still devastating in and of itself, odd fit. With their backpacks on, the astronauts would need about 35 inches of clearance to crawl through the 30-inch hats on the LEM, the Lunar Excursion Module, in the manner claimed by NASA. Awful tight fit. After getting back in the LEM, the astronauts repressurized their cabin. Then, according to NASA, they removed their boots, slipped out of the backpacks heavy with life support equipment that had kept them alive on the moon, reopened the hatch, then dumped them along with crumpled food packages and filled urine bags onto the surface. But there's no airlock on the LEM. So how did they open the door after repressurization and dump their suits in garbage without dying from the supposed vacuum and heat? Or was that cold? This is another point that it wasn't even possible technically to have performed the feat that NASA claims they performed. Here is, in my opinion, a devastating tell-all. NASA has recently advertised, and this is on 29 November 2016, for help to solve its space boot problem and win $30,000. NASA wants your help to solve a rather complicated issue affecting the comfort and safety of its astronauts. After all, when you go, you gotta go, and sometimes you gotta go in a total vacuum. Astronauts have previously relied on adult nappies, that's diapers, while wearing their launch and entry suits. A temporary solution that's only good for around a day, call it 14 hours. NASA is now sponsoring, or even 24 if you want. NASA is now sponsoring the Space Boot Challenge, through which it is seeking the public's help to devise an in-suit waste management system for astronauts to use for up to 144 hours at a time. There's a $30,000 prize up for grabs for whoever comes up with a solution that NASA judges to be most promising for implementation and use on missions in the next 3 to 4 years. But when you consider that the space missions were taking place for 8 days or more, what this reveals is that NASA's entire program, the claims it's made about it, are nothing but a gigantic pile of space poop. Here we have another example. As reported by UK's Daily Mail, NASA officials recently discovered a treasure trove of historical tapes from the Apollo era, when the space agency was sending astronauts to the moon, in a basement in Pittsburgh, and then destroyed them. The nation's space agency may or may not be trying to hide something, but it's just something extremely suspicious after all. If these were legitimate, if this was real footage, then it would have been most valuable, even priceless in the nation's history. They can only have destroyed them because they know that scientific study would reveal the whole thing was a fake and a fraud. So here's a summary overview. Did we go to the moon? We lack the propulsion power. We lack the computing power. We lack the communication ability, where I would add that in an exchange I had on the Huffington Post after a tweet was posted there that was alleged to destroy skeptics of the moon landing, but which simply said anyone who doubts we went to the moon needs to have their brain examined. I posted 6 or 8 comments which the Huffington Post allowed to stand. The most interesting additional comment from another source came from a fellow who had been in television and radio in 1969 and 70, who said that in order to communicate at that time, you needed a van that was the size of a bread truck. Obviously, there was no such van available on the moon. Another proof that we didn't go. Photographic anomalies, a la Jack White. Conspiracy theory, did we land on the moon? Dennis Camino and I have done 2 videos, the Great Moon Landing Hoax and the Real Deal, the Moon Landing Hoax, where we review much of the evidence about the absence of propulsion, computing, or communication capacity. NASA admits the problem going to Mars is the Van Allen radiation belt. They found hundreds of hours of moon landing footage and destroyed it. Help NASA with a space boot problem, only 14 or 24 hours versus 8 days or more. Materials used have melting points too low to make it into outer space. So what we are confronting really is a profound methodological difference from those who want to support the moon landing scenario or hypothesis and those who deny it. The supporters adopt the confirmationalist methodology. Look for confirming instances, such as in relation to the hypothesis, all pennies are made of copper, producing billions of examples of copper pennies as confirmation, rather than adopting the falsificationist methodology advocated by the great British philosopher of science, Sir Karl Popper. Test hypotheses to see whether they can be shown to be false. Where it turns out, for example, that in 1943, because of the shortage of copper for military purposes, they were made of steel. No doubt, this example of the moon landing alternative hypotheses versus the other about the JFK assassination hypothesis demonstrate without any doubt the superiority of the falsificationist methodology over the confirmationist. Here we have 2 covers of National Geographic that confront the alternatives. National Geographic had a special issue about the first explorers on the moon, shown on the left. December 69, Apollo 11 moon landing. Neil Armstrong's famous photo of Irwin Buzz Aldrin walking across the surface of the moon lands on the cover of National Geographic 5 months after the astronaut's historical voyage. Like John Glenn before him, Armstrong carried a small National Geographic flag to the moon and back, which he presented to Society President Melvin Payne when the Apollo 11 crew was awarded the Hubbard Medal in 1970. But far more recently, we have a cover of the National Geographic talking about the war on science, which is actually illustrated of a faking of the moon landing on a sound stage. Now, irony of ironies, the more recent cover about the war on science represents the truth because the moon landing was clearly staged, whereas the original represents the hoax, which the National Geographic, alas, has endorsed. There are signs that the situation may be improving. We have a brilliant Italian producer who is exposing the moon landing hoax in a film which may or may not be already available, but which I can guarantee is going to be a thorough exhibition of the fact that we never went to the moon. And once again, a demonstration of the methodological superiority of falsificationism over confirmationalism. And I just want to say, this is an instructive lesson in history and in logic and critical thinking which I hope everyone who has the opportunity to view this presentation will appreciate, absorb, and apply in the future so they don't get played again. Thank you all for watching.